Okay, morning guys. Now what you'll see is that we're going to cover two unit modules quickly, and we're going to look at it. The ones which we have is module 3 and module 4. Module 3 talks about introduction to the web architecture, which we will be focusing on a bit, and then identifying design elements. Now, what I've done is I've opened the presentations. You can also go through it. Now, from this, it briefly introduces you to the architecture, and the architecture which we're using is based on the Java to EE, Java to Enterprise Edition architecture for structuring web applications. Now, last week we spoke about it. When you create an application, even a web application, what languages is available? What else? Angular? Okay, so but that's I almost want to take jQuery out because it's all part of a JavaScript area around it. Okay. Which of those is front-end languages? Front-end meaning the thing which you will see, the website. What's the purpose of the HTML? To create a structure which you can look at. Can be used with PHP? Yes. CSS, what's the purpose? To give you some form of template, to say how your thing is going to look. It's cascaded style sheets. It's giving you some style for your pages. JavaScript and jQuery? They are giving you the ability to do event management. If you click on something to check, is the values you've typed correct? Did you not leave this field empty? Okay, so it allows you to incorporate things on the page itself where you can then validate information, do certain tasks. Now, when you look at an application, there is a, coming from the Java to Enterprise Edition booklet, some form of structuring what you're seeing. You have your database layer. Then you might have an application server. Now this application server can have different facets in it, but then you can have your client machine connecting to it. But what you need to note from this helps us with the front end, what the person is seeing, what he's seeing on his client machine. What is going to give us the ability at the back end? What languages can you use for your server side? Okay, so on the server side, you can again have PHP. What else? That is where also languages like okay, where's the database? What database can we have? what we're seeing is some of them will be traditional databases, but you also might have an object-oriented database like Mongo or yeah. No, but that's not really databases. Okay, but what you need to note is that this whole presentation on the architecture introduces you to the components. There it's mentioning how can it be deployed. If we have a client, we might directly connect to our server. We might not even have a middle layer or application sitting in between. This means the application is running on the client and it connects directly to our server to get to the database. Just talking about how is it being structured. Then we might also have our client, but on the server side we might have some logic in terms of it. It might contain, in this case they're mentioning EJB, business logic, but allowing us to access our database still. Okay, so what would be an advantage of this compared to the previous one? Multiple people can use, multiple clients can still connect to our server, and your business logic, the business rules and all of that is just defined once here. On the previous one, if you have multiple clients, every application is running is on all of the different client machines. So if you don't make a change to how it's going to connect, you need to go from machine to machine to machine to change that. Okay. Then there's a mention of introducing this to a web environment where we have a web-centric deployment, where you have your client, he connects to a web server. The web server hosts some JSP or servlets and HTML to give you a page. Okay, and that still is allowing us to connect to our data resource. Okay. Then we can also have a multi-tier deployment where we have our client tier connecting to our web tier, which will still host your web server with some JSPs and servlets. But you can then also have a business tier hosting the business logic. And then enterprise information services having your database. What is the difference between the web tier and the business tier? Web tier hosts the logic related to your website. The web server and the processing of requests is done there. But the business rules and about how you can access the data, what can you do on the data, resides in the business tier. It's not hard linked to the web tier. Okay, then there's a quick introduction to where we're just saying if you know how does an HTML page look. It is a opening HTML tag and a closing HTML tag, and it can give us some code. But then there's a mention about Java server pages. Now, Java server page looks like an HTML page. You've created ASP pages. You've done that. How does an ASP page look? Almost exactly like your HTML page, but it has scriptlet portions which you can embed in there. What were some of the problems with that? The only time you see when some error occurs is when you actually run this thing. When you run it, then you start to see, oh, but when I click this, there's now an error in some line of code. It doesn't give it to you when you're writing the code, only when you run it. Okay, so same day they've incorporated some form of script. They created a for loop, and this guy is now going to create a table, And inside the table, it's going to place elements. The person rows. It's going to create rows downwards. Then there's an introduction to the servlet. It allows our web server to handle requests from a web client and provide some form of dynamic content. So this guy can go and generate information. You will see this is now closer to actual either C# or ASP code. But in this case, we have Java code because it's a Java servlet. But what do we see in this case? We have a do get and a do post. What do they correspond to? Some information exchange, but you remember when you're submitting information in HTML, what do you use to submit a form? What is the things which we can add to a form? Two important things. The action and the method. What does the action tell us? Action tells us where is this resource going to be submitted. Okay? You've done it in program. Method tells us what type of method is going to be used. In this case, the method can be get or post. If you're putting it as get, it's going to be putting it as name value pairs as part of your address. Is that very secure? No. Okay. So then there was a quick just mention about things which we can additionally use. We can use like JDBC or Java Mail, additional APIs to incorporate this to do additional things for us. For example, to access a database or SQL file or spreadsheet or so. We can read it in to our application. Then you can use the Java Mail framework to access, to send emails, to do certain tasks related to that for you. Okay. But where does that fit into identifying your design elements? You need to be able to at least see the framework which we will be using, the language subset and programming subset which we'll be working in terms of our architecture. When we now identifying our design elements, what are we doing? As part of this, there is a mention that we're now going from our initial boundary classes and control classes and entities and all of this. We're going to some form of design element. What is the purpose of that? How do we know how many design elements are we going to have? How do I know how many boundary classes am I going to have? Yes, you remember a few weeks back we did the section where we spoke about the user interfaces. Okay, so what helps me to identify how many boundary classes am I going to have? The actual user interface prototypes, because it tells me, okay, if I need to sign into something, I might need one page where I can sign in and a page where I say to the guy, oh, welcome. So that boundary class, initial class, can be divided and set. It's now giving us the actual number of classes we're going to be working with. The same with the control class and entities and so on. So there is just an introduction to this where we're saying that it allows us to translate, to represent our conceptual things and perform some behavior when we're now migrating from our analysis classes to design elements, to identify and handle non-functional requirements. Okay, so the main things which we will be looking at is identifying classes, subsystems, or interfaces. Classes being those fine-grained set of fine-grained responsibilities, subset systems to represent a set of coarse-grained responsibilities, and then interface some abstract declaration. Did you ever use interfaces in your program? Okay. You've used it especially when you did hierarchies and you've created supertypes and subtypes. You've used these guys. Subsystems, that you've used them. Did you use namespaces and the ability to include packages in your programs? Yes. What are you doing? You're in essence using another system or an area which is already written so that you can use those classes in your program. Okay. So there's just a mention about the difference between classes and subsystems. And then they quickly mentioned to us, but we are again going to use stereotypes to identify the different structures. So that when we do all of this, we're looking and saying our boundary class, in this case, can either become a server page or an HTTP servlet. Okay. There's one actually missing there. Your control class can be generated by a servlet or it can be a generic servlet. But what you need to note is that these stereotypes can change based on the actual language and area and architecture you are working with. Why did we introduce these? Again, the stereotype just helps us to group classes with some similar functionality together and say, but this is what it is allowing us to do. Okay. So then there's quickly a mention of identifying the different design classes. And if we are talking about a HTML page or a server page, what do I need to look at to identify them? What was the difference between ASP and HTML? But ASP can also be used to generate the page for you. Okay? What is the difference between the two? Can you see, can you change the page easily with HTML? How? Let's say there we have Blackboard. Can you easily change this if this was hard-coded HTML? Okay. How are you going to change it? By using languages possibly such as ASP or even PHP, so that you can change this dynamically, that you can move things around. That doesn't want to. This will play along. So that you can dynamically change content around. Can you do that dynamically with HTML? Will it be a bit challenging to code it with HTML? In today's frame where we are with JavaScript and jQuery and Angular and all of that, you can possibly use HTML. Okay. A lot of our old applications is still just written by the idea that you would use HTML for static content. What is static content? Content which is going to stay the same. It's not going to be changed. Where dynamic content, you might use ASP or JSP pages like that, because it can be dynamically generated on the server and sent back to the client to display. Okay, so how do I know how many pages am I going to have for a specific boundary class? I might need to look at my user experience elements. What is that? My user prototypes or user interface prototypes. What does this tell me? It tells me how many screens do I need. Does it really tell me what type of screen am I going to have? It doesn't always tell you this nicely. This page, is it going to be HTML or is it dynamic? Can you have buttons on an HTML page? Yes. Okay, so this could have just been some HTML page. You've successfully logged into the system. Is that dynamic or is it static? Why do you say dynamic? Okay, but this is now this might be a new screen which is displayed, a new page which you're taking the person to. What do we see on this? If I click on this guy, what is it going to do? It's going to take me to a new page. Okay, so what do we need to note is when a person clicks login, what's going to happen? It's going to take him to the other page. But firstly, it's going to process the data and see, should it take him there? Let's say this screen needed to tell the person, welcome, and the person's name, and you've been authenticated in that date and time. Is that static or dynamic? You used Blackboard? If you sign into Blackboard, the beginning page, and you go there, what does it tell you? Is this static? Why do you say it's static? Does yours look the same as mine?
You can say yes, because some elements like my course announcements and
Okay.
the information inside changes.
Now what we're seeing with dynamically generated pages is that you might still have static areas. What is static to this page? That top header, this top portion, that's static. It's for everybody, it's the same. These two palettes, but you can move them around. Yeah. So now the question is it still the same for everybody?
Now but it's still the same, it's how you place the styling.
Okay. So this page by itself is dynamic to some extent. It would probably not be generated just by HTML. There would be some other components associated to it. There would be a lot of CSS associated to it. Can you have a CSS file with ASP and with JavaScript file, Java server pages? Yes, because the CSS is just still used to tell it how does it need to look. Okay. So when we identify the user experience elements, it helps us to look at the boundary classes. So what we will see is this mapping is not always one-to-one for each of our prototypes we've created. It's not always going to be meaning that we have one page, because it might in essence mean that we have a lot of pages. We can even restructure this. Was the user experience elements, the ones we've created on paper, was it linked to a language? It was a bit independent. It was saying, this is what we possibly can do. That's what we're seeing, how it should look. Okay. Now, we mentioned that if we identify HTML pages, it's nice for creating static content for some page. Now, if I need to stereotype this as a class, it will be stereotyped as HTML page. Then there was a mention for identifying Java servlet or JSPs. What we're seeing is this helps us if we're looking at dynamic content, and we need to display dynamic content back to the person. Okay, now they will be stereotyped as server pages or server page, because in essence it's generated where? It is ultimately generated on the server, and the server sends back data to you as a client. Okay, so then there's a mention of identifying servlets. Now, it is identified from the control classes for our web architecture. Okay, so it allows us to interact with our databases as in a web-centric deployment. It can also generate presentation pages for us. It can generate HTML. Okay, because you can write data back. But it's a very bad thing to do with it. It's not a nice, appropriate thing to do with it. We can even introduce, for example, enterprise Java beans and restructure the deployment to contain a multi-tiered deployment. What would be an advantage to that? Let's say you are a big company. One of the advantages to this might be that you can structure your application over different machines, different nodes, so that one section can run the database, and what we've looked at earlier, one section can run the business logic, and it can be structured, can be separated. Okay. So when we're identifying servlets, we are stereotyping these guys as either HTTP servlet or a generic servlet. Why HTTP servlet? When would you use it? When you are identifying, when your request is coming from the web, HTTP. But if it's using some other protocol, what would be another other protocol? If you are sending data via a file system, FTP, for example, or you are sending an email, you are using SMTP or POP or so. That is using other protocols which is not beyond this. Okay. So then there's a mention of just Java beans and your enterprise Java beans, where it mentions to us the different ones. We have session beans, which can be stateful, stateless, or singleton, and message-driven beans. Then we also have Java Persistence API or JPA entities, and there is a bit of a discussion that continues into this. Session beans provide services that implement client-specific business logic, and control classes in one case is a good case if we are having client-specific business logic. What is business logic while we're on there? Or business rules, let's go back to that. What is a business rule? Let's take our example back and say we would like to register. You're at the university, you would like to register. What would be a business rule to that? Okay? If you would like to register for a first year, then you must leave. You need to have matric. What about people being over 25? Okay, so is that business rules? Yes. It's rules which the organization places upon this and say, but this is how, what you can do. So these guys, your session beans is a very good, nice guide to handle the business logic and business rules for you. Why? Because the front end portion to this can change around. What type of front ends can we have? We now mentioned web. What about mobile? Can they use all the same business rules? Yes. If the business rules was defined inside your web end, and you would like to introduce a new platform to your business's site, let's say for example mobile, what change does that mean? You would have needed to move all the business logic from this to a new layer, and then only be able to connect your mobile site to the business rules and logic to it. Okay. So that brings us almost back to the structure about multi-tiered deployments, structuring it and all that. Then there's also a mention about the two main types, where stateless is used to model actions or processes that can be done in one shot, like creating a customer. It doesn't really require that we store data. That when I close the tab or page, does it require that I can go back to it? Okay. Then there's a mention of stateful. It guarantees that a client can expect to set the internal state of a bean and cannot and count on the state being maintained between any number of method calls. That information is going to be processed, it will be stored away, and it will be put away for us. Okay, what is the main difference between these two? The one is not going to remember the state. It doesn't really worry about the state and storing information longer. Yes, it might store information to your database, like for example creating the customer, but that will go to the database. If it fails to store the data, is it this guy's responsibility to store it? No. Okay, when you're using a stateful one, if it is attempting to create the customer and it cannot create the customer, it will go back and continue trying to go and create it. Okay. Now when you modeling session beans, we're stereotyping this as EGB sessions, and then there was a message-driven beans, allowing us to provide services that implement some form of message processing. Where do we see message processing? Take for example, if you are sending a message, what happens with that message? Or even let's say a WhatsApp message. It gets pushed to a queue, and if there's nothing in the queue, then it will be processed. But if there's 100 other messages in there, it will start working through it. Okay. So if we have message-driven beans, we'll stereotype them as EJB, MDBs, message-driven beans. Okay. So if there's entities and we are discovering them, how do I know how many entities might there be? Will there be a big change between my data model, which I had identified in analysis, to design? Okay, so there might not be a very big change from analysis to design. So there might be a place that we even go directly go over. So that's why they say to us, our analysis entity classes are a good candidate for our entities. Okay. Now, they are used to provide some form of persistence to us and allows us to interact between our application. Okay. So, who have used the entity framework? Microsoft's entity framework manager allows the same, that when you are using and accessing data from your database, it actually creates classes that looks like the tables which is in the database. Now, when we retrieve data, ultimately it fetches an object. But when you're creating an object, where does it come from? It is based on some class. Okay, so that class is then defined based on that. Now, the same happens when we're working with JSPs, JPAs. Okay. So when we stereotype this, we are seeing that it's being stereotyped as EGP entities. Okay. So how do we know how many boundary classes there is going to be for an application? We need to look at the user interface prototypes. Okay. Open one thing. Okay. You will see there is a walkthrough as part of this, and it introduces you to identifying the design elements. It introduces a table where we can then go and say, we have an artifact, we have the design stereotype, the class name, and possibly the description. Artifact, what does that refer to? It almost goes back to ancient ruins, and we have some thing which we've dug up. But in our case, it refers to from, if I identified this class, from where did I identify it? This gives us some traceability, that when I identify this class, it's coming from some analysis element. Okay. So if we're working with the place order use case, let's say it comes to a place where we are browsing the internet and I want to order a pizza, and I go onto their site and I'm ordering and I'm placing an order. What are you seeing? So the first one that we might have here will be the page to say, but I need to what will we call that first page? It will be a welcome screen. So welcome screen. What would be the description to this? Okay, so if you have to welcome a customer, what type of language will you use? Will you use HTML? Or do you need to use some dynamic language? Why would you use a dynamic language? But is the name of the customer being displayed? Are you going to display the same message to any customer? Okay, so we can display the same message to every customer, really, saying to him, welcome. So it can be static. So this is going to be an HTML page. From where did we identify this? So it might be from some actual user interface for the use case. So you might take all the classes and all the things which you already have in the analysis, and you can start to identify and say, what do I need more? Okay. So we've taken one of them. Now, you'll see as part of the walkthrough to this, it is taking you through the whole process of, let's say, we would like to identify the boundary class, the control classes. So there's a bit more discussion to this. So then there's also a bit mention again about the architecture, the design elements, and discussion about the stereotypes. So there's also mention that if you need to incorporate pages like JavaScript or jQuery or CSS, why do we introduce stereotypes? Just to give it a placeholder to say, but it is going to be based on the following. That we can group our classes with similar functionality together. If the class is going to be based on CSS, where is it going to be placed? How are you going to handle it? Are you going to embed it inside your HTML page or JSP page? Or are you creating it as a separate page outside? Okay. Guys, any questions on identifying design elements?